In other words, would you baptize an extraterrestrial? Funny you should ask. If you go to Barnes & Noble, you'll find a book with exactly that title that my friend Paul Muller and I have written. There's a copy of it. It's a great question because it makes you ask, what does baptism actually mean? What is our relationship? What does it mean to have a soul? Catholic theology says that the essentials of the image and likeness of God, the soul, is intellect and free will, which is to say, I've got to be aware that I exist and that you exist, and I have to be free to say, hello, I want to be your friend, or get the heck out of my way. I have to be free to sin or not sin. If you're free to do that, it seems to me, somebody in your species is going to do it and sin. And if you have made that crime against God, you're going to need forgiveness. You're going to need some sort of redemption. But it doesn't say that every redemption story has to be the same story as here. I'm not saying that there is, a fourth and a fifth and a sixth person of the Trinity going out and doing these salvations. It's the same Jesus Christ who was there in the beginning, according to the Gospel of John. But I am saying that I would love to find out what their redemption stories were like. Just as we know the redemption story of the angels is different from the redemption story of human beings. Wonderful to find out.
I like your answer. That's not quite the same thing that Sister Agnes said in the 8th grade, though.
Well, she wasn't a Jesuit. I do have to say, in defense of the Sisters of Charity that I had, Sisters of Charity in Cincinnati, mind you, in the Detroit area, taught me science and taught me wonderful theology. So, yes?
Brother, based on the facts that you've seen and the pictures that you've seen of Pluto, would you change your mind?
No. And here's the reasoning. First of all, ask any 8-year-old kid today, is Pluto a planet? And they will say, absolutely no! It says so in my book that it's a dwarf planet. You've got it wrong. Because 8-year-old kids are pretty smart. Back in the days, when Pluto thought it was a planet, all of the other planets made fun of it because it had the wrong orbit and the wrong shape, and it was really, really dinky. It's a tenth the size of the Earth's moon. And it felt really eccentric and left out. But then it discovered that it's just one example of a whole new class of objects that we never knew about before. We've given the unfortunate name dwarf planet to because we can't come up with a better name. But bodies like Makemake and Haumea and Eris and even Ceres. Now we realize that Pluto, is a beautiful swan of its type of object. And it's very unhappy if you try to push it into a category it doesn't belong.
Great lecture tonight. Thank you very much. I did want to ask, as a scientist, as a theologian, how do you rectify the book of Genesis and all the scientific knowledge that you learned and know?
Well, all the scientific knowledge that I know is in textbooks that I learned. And the textbooks I learned from are all obsolete. No one would use the biology book that their parents used in a biology class. Science books go obsolete because science is always, by its nature, almost correct. And as we make the corrections, we then have to step the next step to where we're almost correct. That's the nature of science. Genesis is not a science book because I don't throw Genesis away any more than I would throw away Plato or Shakespeare. Genesis is a completely different kind of animal. For one thing, Genesis is not a science book because science books weren't invented when Genesis was written. Secondly, Genesis is not a book about science. It's a book about God. What is God like as a creator? Chapter 1 gives the best science of its day 3,000 years ago, It says, unlike what the Babylonians would tell you, actually the universe is made by a God who's supernatural, who does it deliberately, who is in a relationship with this creation, and in fact loves this creation. Chapter 2 of Genesis is a very different story. You can't even match up chapter 1 and chapter 2 if you're trying to do that. But the same message about God is there. And then in the Psalms, we have the heavens proclaiming in a way that's not described in Genesis, but again, it's the universe and God and a love relationship. And in the book of Maccabees, we have this wonderful scene where a mom is encouraging her sons who are about to be persecuted. And in an offhand way, this mom says one of the most profound statements in philosophy, that God created the universe from nothing, which is different from what you see in Genesis 1. But the point is still there. God is outside the universe, not a nature God. And so I don't care if it's the Big Bang Theory or whatever theory we have 1,000 years from now, which will make the Big Bang look silly, I hope, because that's how science should progress. In any of these changes of cosmology, I still believe in a God who is supernatural and created the world out of love. Now, having mentioned the Big Bang, I do want to remind you there was a fellow, Stephen Hawking, who wrote a book a few years ago saying, I know how the Big Bang happened, he says. It was due to a quantum fluctuation of the primordial gravity field, which even when there's a vacuum, you still have a zero-point energy that can fluctuate itself, maybe by chance, into a fluctuation big enough to cause the Big Bang itself. And therefore you don't need God. There's a philosophical fallacy there. He is defining God as the force that started the Big Bang, because that's what he thinks creation is. And then he says, gravity is what caused the Big Bang, which doesn't mean there is no God, but rather that gravity is God, which is kind of a weird thing to believe, and I'm sure he doesn't actually believe that. Gravity is God. Maybe he thinks that's why Catholics celebrate Mass. The philosophical point is that creation is not something that happened 13.8 billion years ago. Creation, in the philosophical sense, is the creation of vacuum itself, the creation of time itself, the creation of space itself, and it occurs by a God who is acting, for lack of a better word, outside of space, outside of time. Creation didn't happen then, it's happening now, it's happening in the future. Every instant that existence is allowed to exist is the creation point. And that's a very different kind of creation than just the beginning of the Big Bang.
My question is about the 4 blood moons.
Oh, right,
And
yes.
how they relate to the world today.
No, they don't mean anything. It's that simple. There's a lot of wonderful misinformation on the internet. And most of what you read about blood moons is misinformation on the internet. Along with the idea that, oh, Mars is going to be 10 times brighter than the full moon. Where do they get these things? Walk outside. Look, Mars is never going to be as bright as the full moon. But the difficulty is that we know I think the real difficulty is there's a disconnect between the learning we get through our brains from reading and the experience we have when we walk outside. When you walk outside, the world's flat. The sky's a dome. Everybody can see that. It takes a powerful imagination to realize that the world isn't exactly flat, but it curves ever so gently until it becomes a sphere. We know things through reading and through books that we haven't internalized through actual, even Even physics professors who are, by budget cuts, have to do their experiments in computer simulations online, rather than allowing the kids to get their fingers dirty in a laboratory. And the trouble is, there is this disconnect between the stuff we see online or the stuff we see in television and our real lives. And somehow we think the stuff that's on television is real. So that the fact that I've been on TV with Colbert is much more exciting than the fact that I've been in Louisville talking to you. I mean, Colbert's a nice guy, but I didn't see him on TV. I saw him in person. And that was fine. Turn off your TVs. Go look at the universe.
A couple of, about a month ago, it was in a local paper that there was an object 3 trillion miles away from Earth.
Mhm.
How did he come up with that sort of estimation?
How do we know these distances? You got to take Chris's astronomy class to really know, because it's not trivial. In some way, it's a house of cards, but it's a pretty solid house of cards. The easiest way is if you know intrinsically how bright something is, and you can see how bright it actually is to your eye, you can calculate how far away it must be. So you get an idea of how far away stars are doing that. It's not perfect, but that's one of a dozen different ways that people have to try to estimate sizes and distances. But it is not at all trivial. And we're still refining those measurements, and we continue to.